All right, we're back live, and thank you, Tyler, for supporting DEF CON, supporting the community, supporting the Red Team Village. An honor to have you here. And with that said, without any further ado, take it away.
Okay. Hey, good evening, late night DEF CON. This is 50 Shades of Sudo Abuse. I'm Tyler Boykin, and this will be my talk. So we'll do a quick about, and the intended audience level for this kind of thing is, beginner to intermediate, and there's plenty of talks on some whiz, some cool advanced stuff, right? But just figured we keep it in the beginner and intermediate range, or if you're a more seasoned professional, you may pick up a few things, maybe a good refresher. We'll do a brief kind of crash course on Sudo, on where it stands on the TTP, in the MITRE kind of realm of things, and then we'll cover the Sudoers file. And then we'll hit up some enumeration and recon, and then we'll go into the fun stuff, which are all the examples. So a little bit about me. I'm a Aggie communications officer with the Marine Corps. Cut my teeth with network engineering and information assurance, and then now I do security engineering for BioLite Professional IT Services. And so you can find me on Twitter and a few other places. Okay, so super user do, whether you're calling it sudo or sudo, whatever, we're talking about the same thing, right? And it's basically, it allows you, any permitted user, to execute commands as another intended user. Typically 90% of the time, it's going to be root, right? And the security policy, which is what we'll dive into as we're going into this, determines what privileges, what allocations, what all can that user do. And whereupon authentication, specific tokens are made on the, Sudo tracks each and every failed or successful authentication, and it'll remember you for 5 minutes. So if you ever notice that, and then so on. And so when you execute a command, and you'll see this later on too, unlike SU, as you were, the security policy just states which environment you get. So whenever you are actually running sudo, you inherit all of that user's in full environmental variables. For instance, you get unless it's explicitly stated otherwise. So you typically get their environment variables. You'll get a variety of IDs, right? And unless you specify otherwise, real effective user IDs, group IDs, right? You get a good variety of things up there, but it's as the target user. And so this is straight out of this, and these are straight out of the Sudo man pages. I'm just going, inch deep, mile wide stuff, just to kind of give a little bit of a background. There is no easy way, right? There is no easy way, and this is to prevent a user, malicious user, from, escalating, abusing stuff if stuff is allocated, simply because there's the whole breadth of things there's just the breadth of applications and features that can be manipulated maliciously. It gets rather hard. And so, there are ways to mitigate this. You enforce you really crank down on the least privilege kind of method of the security and whatnot, but it's really, you have to be particularly stringent when allocating stuff. Okay, so we'll kind of shift gears here into MITRE. And so it falls under abuse elevation control. So this shouldn't be anything new, right? This is pretty similar vernacular to what we've been talking about the past couple of minutes. Adversaries may circumvent mechanisms, designed to control and elevate privileges to higher level, and so on. And so where the sudo and the sudoers falls into is now the new format, which they went to sub-techniques. And I'll give you all a quick minute to read that. I think y'all got it. No, I'm just kidding. So basically it says the same thing. Adversaries may perform pseudo caching, and that's to where they go after those token files, and each user. And so in the directory, each user that attempts to authenticate via sudo gets their own specific directory, right? And then each attempt has its own little file. It's kind of cool. And then, so adversaries may attempt to abuse the caching or misconfigurations in Sudoers, in which that is where you'll actually wind up seeing you'll wind up seeing a lot of the stuff for all this talk, or mostly out of Sudoers misconfigurations. Okay, and that's a good segue. So Sudoers, it's the primary configuration file when you're working with sudos. With sudo, it resides in OSCE. Technically, you can edit it with whatever you want to. That is not encouraged because it is very syntax picky. So generally speaking, you make a copy of it and you use vi sudo. And if you use vi sudo to edit the file, right, it'll run the error checking, the syntax checking immediately upon exit. Or you can just, let's say if you wanted to tweak something, mess with something, you can always just run the standalone checker on the file. So that's what it's basically going to look like. You're going to have, if you make a misconfiguration anywhere in Sudoers, it'll yell at you like that. And if you're good, then it tells you, okay. So the Sudoers specifies the who, what, when, where. Right? It's the be all end all. Other documents kind of contribute to this whole security or this whole policy, but the main point of configuration, excuse me, is Sudoers, right? And so unlike by default, password authentication is required, but you can specify no password. But unlike SU, where you authenticate as the user which you are trying to do stuff as, so let's say root, you have to authenticate as root. Sudo, when using Sudoers, you authenticate as the user calling it, right? And so it's a little bit less. And so the file is composed of two main parts. It has some other sections too, but and you can go into a little bit more detail about that. But for the purposes of what we're doing here, right, you're going to have your aliases, which are kind of like variables and placeholders, right? And then you have your user specs, which are the 5 Ws, and there's quite a few user specs. And for these examples, and so when multiple entries stack up, they're applied in order. You see that a lot in user specs. And then it interacts and stacks into the last one. Okay. So aliases, the interesting thing is that the syntax on the man pages are actually a little less, when you see them in a Sudoers file, it kind of makes sense because stuff, right? But the format kind of But essentially it's alias type, name, and then you go on and you can specify whatever you're trying to alias. And then you have your defaults that you can always set to. And so moving on a little bit, the sudo allows for shell style globs and wildcards. It's not actual regex, but if you've ever done anything in bash or shell or whatever, right? It's similar in functionality. An asterisk, is one or more. And then question mark is in any single character. You can kind of do range, kind of splitting between brackets and so on. But it's not actual regex, but it functions similar to what you see in bash or any kind of shell. Okay, so we're down to the user specs. And this is actually a little bit more of the intuitive part, in my opinion, because it's the who, what, when, where. You have the who, where, in the parentheses, you have the as whom, and you can use colons to delineate further detail of into that, right? And then the what. And then sandwiched between the what are tag specs that kind of throw stipulations on some of the activities on how it's done. And we'll go into that with the next slide or two. And so the run as spec, so for example, me at server, me at host server, as operator, these commands. It's not too wet. And so tag spec, and this is what I was talking about earlier, it sandwiches in between the as whom and the command part, right? And this can either drastically make, you know, a red teamer's life easier, or it can make it a little bit more difficult, make it more complicated. No password, you'll see sometimes. Set in will also, you can deliberately manipulate the environment when you're calling those commands. And no exec prevents DLL, dynamically linked applications from actually calling shell on themselves or running commands themselves, you know. So say, and we have an example of that later on also. But I'm gonna hope for that no password. So much easier. Okay, so enumeration. So there's manually, right? You have sudo L, and if you're lucky, and you know, this could be for any kind of real world pen testing, CTFs, could be for any type of thing, right? You have sudo L, and it might be as easy as that. The user that you may have compromised may be the Sudoers, and when you do sudo L, you may get a listing of every, you know, what all that user can do, right? You have etc Sudoers. It should, hopefully it exists. If you can read it as an unprivileged user, I think there are bigger things going on, or you're in a CTF, you know, but I mean, that would help enumerate and get a bigger picture of things. In the event that you cannot, for instance, let's say you can't do sudo, but you're still trying to look at version numbers or whatever else, you can still get the version of number from sudo with capital V and just do some Googling. You know, maybe you can find a user or service that can't use sudo, and then you may be able to leverage that for exploitation. Etsy group, and so same thing. You can see additional users that may be in, you know, the Sudoers group, and then one of the places it logs is to var log for auth log, and so that's all manual stuff. And generally speaking, because this is a subset of privilege escalation, so you don't need as much expansive tools and resources to really enumerate what you have per se. You know, like let's say if you're doing some other things, but there are automated things for MSF. You know, you have post modules. I think Interpreter has a few also, and then there's some pretty well-known scripts too, like linenum. Anybody who's done like CTFs and some other things has used linenum. That's a pretty well-known one. Follow sudo is actually pretty neat also, and I make another reference to the creators of that, and that particular one in the middle references that for that particular CVE, and so. Yep. Okay, so examples. So this is from, you know, the creator of follow sudo, and this is more the degree of examples, because it's kind of a spectrum, right? And I like to use the hanging fruit kind of analogies, right? So the two examples, a complete lack of configuration, right? It's nothing, wide open, it's low hanging fruit, right? That's the lowest hanging fruit, and you should go for the lowest hanging fruit first, because those are the givens. Or you might see they've tried to configure secure sets of rules, you know, but there may be a bug in one of the applications. It may be some flag, or they just didn't know, you know, and so, but they're trying, or it just may not be configured consistently throughout whatever they're doing, right? And so, which is actually pretty normal for any other kind of real system hardening and whatnot. You get the lowest of the fruit, you get the open sudo, and then you got the top part, which is the fairly secure, as he was mentioning. But for today's purposes, we're going to be mostly residing mostly in the middle. You'll have a little bit of low fruit, and we'll have a little bit of the cool stuff up at the top. But the middle is going to be, that's where the fun playground is, because it's a little bit gamier, in my opinion. Okay, so when you're doing this, and you know, you want to get creative and inventive, because you don't necessarily have to get it like a fancy CVE per se with these. You know, you don't have to make an alphanumeric freaking ROP chain, you know, or anything like that. You're just using what exists. creatively. And so that's kind of the cool part about it, and can you read something off limits? Can you write to something? If you can write to something, then you can go really further then, right? Can you, this is where you're scouring the man pages, right? And you're looking for flags. You're looking for little subtle things that may be kind of useful. And so that's why it's more fun, and it's kind of a misnomer, escalate laterally. You may be able to move laterally. I haven't really seen any non-root users specified Sudoers, but that's an option. You can do sudo as a different user, and so, but if using that gets you to a different user, I mean, that's worth mention on a pen test report, right? And that may get you to something bigger and better. It's not always about up and down. Sideways works too, right? And so with that, we are now entering low-hanging fruit. So this is the easy stuff. Open sudo, the classic example, right? Wide open, user authenticates as himself, his or herself, whatever. And then the system is their oyster, right? They're they're keystrokes away from root. And so we go into a little bit more. So any applications that directly result in a shell, they're pretty much right next to there. This is your SH, KSH, ZSH, whatever, right? SU, and any actual programming languages too, because those can, again, cough up shells. Cough up shells, cough up functionality. Those are pretty big gimmies. And so then we go, this is kind of like a little bit higher. We're turning up the volume, on the creativity a little bit, right? And so you have you got commands, right? And then so they can't give you instant shells, but it's not right off the bat. So you got to dig for stuff a little bit, and you have to use stuff unintended. You got to think outside the box. And so that's why I kind of like some of these. And so here are a few examples. When you do wget, right, for instance, if you supply I as an input file, it'll attempt to read each line in that file as its own URL, and it'll attempt to shoot it. So if you do sudo wget whatever, let's say etsy shadow, right, each line of etsy shadow is going to be, wget's going to try to resolve or make a request to each line of etsy shadow. I mean, it'll fail, but that's file read, right? You're now reading sensitive files that you're not supposed to, and same thing with curl. And this one's actually kind of cool. These are two web request applications, and you don't even have to make an actual web request for them, really, so it's kind of neat. And so you continue to offset, and then it'll automatically find where to resume, and you basically specify the remote name, which is local, and so then you specify file. It actually accepts in this format here, file, kind of like you're doing FTP or whatever, or HTTP. No, the location on the local system, and it'll download it, and you can read it. It's actually pretty neat. Base 64 is another interesting sample. That's file read. I think it does file write also. I'll have to double check. But essentially, right, you're looking at, it's file read, and if you pipe it into itself and supply the D flag, you have the clear text. You have it un64'd. And then GCC, if you supply wrappers, right, it'll run the command that you supply, and all params are passed comma separated after the initial command. And this and then at the very end, we're tagging along. Let's say you have kind of a bug, or like a big gaping kind of bug thing, right? And it's kind of a mix between the high level and the low level, but any bugs, right, that are incurred at sudo are going to have sudo consequences also. So where's my demo thing? Okay, so we will do some shell time. How about this? So L section 1 open sudo. So yeah, sudo L, right? anything, you do sudo su cat root text. That's what it looks like. That's what I'm using for this particular for these particular purposes. Looks like that kind of jazz, right? So apt sudo l. And so this is pretty much the same thing too. If you run sudo is any of the top two, you're going to get an instant shell. Creatively, I think it's the kind of neat one, and one that you can use for if you're working trying to get a non-limited shell is with the Python. And so Python and most interpreted kind of languages and some things accept inline commands, correct? So for pity spawn, pity the fool, bash, right? And so then your root. It's pretty cut and dry. Those are pretty straightforward. So now we're getting into a little bit more fun stuff with wget and whatnot. So the so if you notice, it accepts an input file, and so that basically that's what it looks like. It tried to run the flag in our particular case as it tried to make a request to it, and then obviously it's going to fail because it's nothing, right? And so that's I thought it was pretty neat when I first learned that, right? And so base 64, similar thing. This was good. It comes in as you basically piping it to itself, and you specifying the D, which means decode. So here we go. Wrapper. We have got root. It ran sh. And then lastly for this little bit, curl. So it literally downloads on the spot, like into the local directory. We've got the flag. Bada bing, bada boom. And so in this particular instance, it's just a small program, say mycat, right? Just to show an example. Obviously, and didn't mention this before, but as we progress along, you'll see a common trend of applications having more than one exploitation vector, right? So it may not just be file read. It can do file write. It may be able to do commands, right? It's just depending on, it depends on how you work it and whatnot. And so in this particular case, it's the it basically takes in through standard input and sends that to system, right? So there's two, at least two with this one. So I do sudo mycat, do root text, right? File read, sensitive file read, but you can also bin sh, get root, typical string exploitation. Okay, now we're going to get a little bit fun now. So pager abuse. Where are my, okay. Oh, those got mixed up. Okay, so pagers. So whenever you run man or service or any kind of terminal editor, and those things where you can scroll up, down, left, right, it's called a terminal pager. And the interesting thing is that people know what it is, but they don't know what it is per se. But it's basically what happens behind the scenes is a terminal pager gets called, and they accept extra commands. When you supply an exclamation mark, anything preceding that exclamation mark gets run as a command. So your editors, Vim, Nano, etc. And so yeah, we'll go ahead and show that right quick, like L section 2 pagers. If I can type clear sudo L. So yeah, if I do sudo man, quick example, we're now in a terminal pager. You can go up, down, left, right, whatever. By simply just typing stuff, it'll start parsing your input. And by doing exclamation mark, everything after this will be ran as a system command. So bin sh, we're now root, etc. You know, and same thing with service too. So sudo service blank status to get, I'm gonna get all of them, and then kind of open up a pager. Same thing. Bin sh, easy peasy. And so a neat thing is it didn't occur. You tend to forget these types of things. But let's say you do a service, but it doesn't have that particular, much output. It's not really it's more just kind of terminal fundamentals, perhaps. Let's say you do cron status, right? And actually, it does do a pager right there midway. But if for whatever reason, if the pager ends prematurely, let's say if it finishes, you can always just shrink your freaking terminal down to like here, and then do it again, and it'll open up the pager for you. So I think that's kind of neat. Okay. So yes, get to GTFO bins. A lot of these are on GTFO bins. Now I tried not to just go down and just start listing them off. I try to grab a variety of different things, but so yeah, GTFO bins is definitely very, very handy. If you're not using that, you're definitely crippling yourself in what you can do. Okay, cron abuse. So this kind of goes without saying. If you can edit, if you can manipulate or run or do any kind of service types of things as root, that's going to have root-like implications, and so that's pretty. That's one thing. That's a pretty short slide, but so sudo l or sul, sorry, section 3 cron l. Yeah, and so in this particular instance, right, and so it's actually worth noting that if you do cron tab, if you haven't done it before on the system, and you don't have the right environmental variables set, what's the first thing it asks you? It asks you what editor would you like to use, and so then you have editor, editor styled exploits with whatever kind of services you can do also. So in this particular case, sudo l. So let's do sudo cron tab e, and I already have something set up. But now we're in freaking Vim, right? So any kind of easy peasy. But you can also, it's also the implication that you can edit the root's cron tab and run stuff as root, any kind of services. In this particular case, I have this little script here, and all it does is, just for the example, it basically reads in root text and writes it to the current directory. It's pretty easy peasy. So sudo service cron start. And you'd have to wait a minute. And let me see what's going on the Discord. Okay. So at some point, probably in a minute, I might not just wait for it, but we'll see root text should hopefully populate up here. But I don't think I'll wait for that. So you'll have to deal with it. Okay. So now we're getting into a little bit more fun stuff. LD preload is actually kind of neat. So, and you need a bit of a background to understand what's going on. So LD preload, it's an exploit. You're abusing a feature that is intended to be used with dynamically linked binaries, whereas with all the methods and all the stuff is resolved at runtime, whereas it's statically linked. You get that bigger file if you statically link everything, but you don't have to worry about shared objects, being all messed up and whatever. You have everything in one nice big package, But this gives you, but obviously with dynamic linking, you do have a smaller file size, and you have your typical your libc and a bunch of other things to worry about. But I mean, overall, it's a little bit more flexible. And so with the LD preload is actually you could essentially tell it to load that stuff before it loads the other stuff, right? And so you can essentially overwrite any kind of method or function in whatever application you're running, and then so we need to put a few things together. You're combining a custom functionality with a binary that's being run as sudo, and obviously that's going to equal fun, pretty fun, and you'll see this in the environment whenever whenever I've seen it, it's been in the environment, and the binary also has to be compiled for it. And so the syntax for when you want to go about business with this is sudo ld preload. You specify, you can make it you can export it to the env, to your environmental variables, or you can just run it all one, like how we're about to do here in a minute. So demo. So L section for LD preload clear. So in this particular case, we can run the example, and I tried to cite. I got some of these examples straight off the internet. I tried to cite them. You can find these. I linked to them, so if you want to look at them, reference them too. So in this particular case, the example was it runs a loop and it prints 10 random numbers. It calls rand and it outputs the standard out 10 numbers. So in this particular case, because it's a dynamically linked, right, we can provide our own stuff, and we have the LD preload environmental variable set. So in this particular case, cat d random, and basically it's going to overwrite the rand function, and it'll just return 42. So example C right here, right? And so you're basically going to make you're going to make that do what you want it to, which is kind of cool. So for this particular example, sudo, where are we at? One moment, please. I had it up here. Oh, where? So sudo ld preload d. Let's see, what is it? D random shared object to example. And as you see, we basically made random do what we want to. So it's no longer random. It just prints 10 42s instead of a bunch of actual random. So taking that a step further, we can manipulate the file as sudo. So what do? We get evil, and in this particular case, we're overwriting init, which happens right off the bat. And, we basically pop shell. And so using a similar type thing, evil, we are now root. It's pretty cool. And another cool thing is that it will finish running the rest of the application once we exit. See, because we only overwrote init, we didn't overwrite the rest of it. So it's kind of neat. Okie dokie. Okay. Installers. So it goes without saying, right, that installing any kind of application is a security concern, especially if you're going to install it as admin, as root, any kind of privileged accounts, right? And so these can definitely be leveraged in various kinds of ways. Pip, apt-get, dpackage, you name it. And so, like for instance, a lot of these have multiple. Let's say apt-get and dpackage. They both invoke a pager. You can do stuff during install, providing custom functionality. For example, pip. When you run setup pi or when it's set up, you can specify entire methods for doing stuff. It becomes your oyster. So obviously, installing things right as root is a big critical security consideration. Okay, we will hit that up. L section 5 cron. Oh, installer. Sorry. Okay, so sudo L. Okay, so how does one make that a shared object? You compile and link. You basically don't do a full compile. You don't do the full process when you compile. And we can pull. I'm sure if somebody doesn't share that with you, we can grab that here after this. But basically, you make it a shared object, and it can be used by other dynamically linked applications. So let me grab my thing right quick, here. Okay, so for the pager, right? Pager abuse, sudo apt-get. Oh, my bad. Change log. See, we now have a pager. So the old stuff still applies, right? And so having that kind of mentality that, oh yeah, we're in familiar territory, right? It'll help us for later on, right? And so in this example, we have apt-get shell package, and all it's doing, you're basically providing custom functionality, and it runs at the very end. So all you got to do, you can just specify, instead of making a normal web request out, you specify a local file for which to draw from, and then it basically goes like that. It's pretty cool. So, and the same thing with when you go to pip. So in this particular case, we have a setup py, like what you'd see in any kind, if you're installing any kind of module, any kind of thing written in Python or whatever, you'll have your setup py, right? And in this particular case, it actually does a reverse shell. And so I need to split screen for a minute. I think that one was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. If we do sudo pip install dot from the dot to specify from the local directory, and we do, and we have bada bing, right? Pretty cool. Exit all that jazz. Okay. Right on. So path and secure path. So these, so if you recall back, right, globs and whatnot, are acceptable within the Sudoers file. To include, the asterisk, star, whatever is one or more, question marks, 2 characters, and so on. So, and this is kind of in the same family as your normal environmental variable path, right? It's in the same vein of exploitation. If you see asterisks, you see stars in the Sudoers file, you can have similar consequences too. So it's kind of similar in this particular case, not exactly, but for example, if you see a dot in env, it's going to read from the current directory first, wherever it's being invoked, and then it goes on, right? It goes on down the line, right? And if you see an asterisk, that means anything for that directory. And so that's what's happening in this particular case. Anything in bin, is free game. And so obviously that's not particularly secure. And so, interesting enough, for Sudoers, right, you have the secure path. So if you don't actually trust like the environmental variables at the lower level to be like well-formed or whatever, or to be secure, you can kind of override that with your own secure path. But obviously if the secure path is misconfigured, that's fun for more than one person involved. So, and in this particular example, we made secure path temp to show that's kind of a misconfiguration of sorts. So L section 6 path. I believe for this one I'm doing the bin. Yeah. So, and it's also worth noting, right, in other kind of privilege escalation mindset that I could run anything in this directory, and so as sudo, So you can basically write your own shell. You can do whatever, and it'll do, it'll run what you want. So in this particular case, I just made ID, it runs shell. It's weird, but whatever. And so sudo, let me copy all that. I ain't typing that stuff. Boom, ID. We have shell. It's pretty intuitive. And then sudo L. So this particular one, it's going to check temp first, because that's a misconfiguration on the secure path. And it's a particular one, and there's actually another exploit later on that utilizes double stars, but this is for the example of this purposes. Where is ping usually at? Ping is usually user bin, right? But obviously, if we do sudo temp, and ahead of time it's a temp to ping, right? You get the flag, because in that particular file, it does the same thing. It's just reading and printing, right? And so that's just insecure path considerations when you're using globs and whatnot. Okay. So we're getting there. We are getting there. Okay, so this one's kind of neat. So editors and sudoedit. So you have your obvious kind of blatant stuff. You got your pager, whatnot, and anything with editors, you have file read, file write, any kind of commands. But how it does some things are kind of weird, right? And so and there's a few new things I stumbled upon while I was even making this, in the past months. So, and we will include an actual CVE with this also, because it's kind of in the same line of things. And so, and this is the actual CVE. It's on exploit DB. Sudoedit does not check the full path. So if you use double globs, so the POC for this is you create a symlink to anything sensitive, right? Anything sensitive, and it'll resolve that as correct, and it'll run it, and you're good. It's pretty cool. So we will get to keyboard mashing. L section 7 editors clear. Sudo L. Okay, so we can do that one first. So in this particular example, we have two directories. Test2 with protected, which is the actual symlink to it. That is it's going to Etsy Shadow right now. And then we have, let me scooch that up a little bit for us here. There we go. All right, and so var, I just made some durs, and this one it's actually really nothing. I think it has some stuff on it. I forget what I put on there. But either way, the user can't access either of them because they are, it does not have the permissions, right? But so if I were to do sudoedit, right, and then specify test2 protected. Oops. So it is worth noting that if you fat finger something, you fat finger it, it will ask you for a password. So if you specify no password on a security policy, and whatever you're doing is prompting you for a password, then that action is not covered under that policy, and you're likely not going to be able to do it. Hold on. Sudoedit. Test. There we go. Okay, and so now we are in Etsy Shadow. I must have been fat fingering something. So this next example is actually kind of cool. So we have this entry right here. It's no password. So they're trying to lock us down to them, but they also have no exec. And so if you recall what no exec is, it means no shells, or you can't run commands. You especially can't pop shells, right? And they're trying to lock us down to where we can only edit this particular file, which doesn't exist, but that's what, but you can obviously open it. You can create the file and then save or do whatever in Vim. So sudo, and we'll test that theory, right? Sudo Vim, let's say we want to do root.txt, right? Can't do it because we're being prompted by a password. Let's say if we do sudo Vim and we actually do go to this, right? So obviously, and if we try to do our typical shenanigans, right? Nope, denied, no shell for you, right? It's pretty cool. But here's a neat trick. You can source externally from within editors to doing your own stuff. So :E for edit, R for write, for read, right? Exactly. So I think that's pretty neat. And then you can basically kind of like wiggle around from inside, kind of like that. Okay, we are hooking and jabbing. We got a couple more, and then we are dunskies. So Pwdfeedback. This one is an actual. This is also an actual CVE, and has an exploit DB entry. So basically, in older renditions of sudo, it'll ask you for your password, but when you supply stuff via standard input, it gives little stars. And essentially, there is a stack-based up buffer overflow. It's too many, too much input with through standard input, and you supply long enough of a string, you can then put in whatever malicious goodness that you want. And it's actually pretty. It's actually pretty simple exploit, and it's pretty simple to check out. And we will go ahead and do that. However, I need to see what user. 1 second. I need to get what I call these because I don't call them all intuitive names per se. 8. Well, that one is. Okay. Okay, Pwdfeedback, right? So sudo L, in this particular case, we do, we do need it this time. We do need it to prompt us for a password so we can actually exploit, we can smash the stack basically. And I have 2 POCs, and then I think ones you can find it on, I think I'll link to at least one of these. They're pretty self-explanatory. So this first one, it's 100 days. It's 100 days terminated by a null, and it does this 50 times. And then after that, you can pipe in whatever stuff, whatever commands you want, generally speaking, after the S. And so for instance, if I were to do sudo, actually, POC, rear root. Right, and notice in here we're not actually supplying a password because it did ask us for a password, right? So if we do sudo whatever, it asks us for a password and we had to supply it. But because we smashed the stack basically and then supplied our own command, that's basically how we went out of business there. And the same thing with POC 2 is the same concept. It's just more fanciness. In that case, it does a reverse shell, like before. Okay, we have about 10 minutes left. I'm going to go ahead and we can do that one too. Why not? Why not? Tmux. This one was 3.4. C2. That's curious. Oh my God. Well, they all almost worked. I have to fuck with that later, but you'll get the general principle. Exit. Demo gods. So, okay. Limited shells. This one's actually pretty neat, and I learned this actually by doing Pentester Academy. you know. And so, and if you're trying to look for different neat kind of ways to enhance your existing skill set, right, or learn completely new things, I highly encourage that. You know, I'm not trying to shill for Pentester Academy or VVIC, but I mean, he's a great instructor, and they have some great coursework. And so, in this particular one, just showing this particular example, and it's kind of a hypothetical too, right? So let's say you have a particular you have user's credentials. You can do normally you would be able to do sudo as a user, but you do not have a full TTY. Let's say for whatever reason you can't make a full TTY. You can't do the SOCAT, the STTY raw echo trick, you know, all those normal things. Let's say those aren't working, but you still have a limited shell, and you have the ability to run sudo, because you can run sudo and you have the user's credentials, right? So you can use, in this example, the expect command, right? And the expect command basically simulates user interactivity. And command, you know, on the man page, they're listed alphabetically, but there's 4 of them that you would practically really need to know in order to run this example. Spawn, which spawns the command or whatever you supply. Send is providing input to standard input. Expect parses, I think it does both standard out and standard error. I haven't tested that, but I think it does both. It at least does standard out. And then you have interact, and then that basically goes it's hands-on at that point. It's kind of like if you ever used POEM tools with Python, right? It's like the interactive, similar kind of mentality there. And so I'll break this down. Expect C, you're supplying the command. You then spawn sudoes. So it's kind of like a spawn the spawn thing, right? Sudoes. In this case, we're just going to read root.txt. You know, we spawn that process. We then look for, with globs, it supports globbing too. So you don't have to be exactly. You can, there's a little bit of wiggle room when you're doing your expect. We're looking for password, because that's typically what you see whenever you're prompted, you know, by sudo. We will provide the password, you know, which in this case it's always the username, because for demo examples, you do have to provide your own enter, and then you interact. So demo. Okie dokie. And this one will require a limited shell, or require a reverse. I think it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I forget. 5. Okay. So in this case, I made a shitty little. Didn't really make. Oh, it's 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm sorry. 4. Okay. So it's a little crummy shell. You can't do anything. You don't have an environment. There's no terminal. There's no nothing. It's bare bones. What you might see, it's what you might see if you're doing a CTF, a real life pen test, you know, where you don't actually have functionality, or, you know, it's a limited shell is a limited shell is a limited shell, right? No, you got nothing really per se. So in this particular instance, we can then supply the big glob that we had previously. And so hit enter, and there's our flag. Okay, so we're at the finish line now, and this one's actually a pretty quick one, and it's more recent too. This one it doesn't check for the existence of a user, and so when it runs, it executes with the arbitrary user ID, and it returns as 0. 0 is also root's ID, right? And so, and then it matches executed privileges, or whatever you specify on the end of it. And you can test that out too, because if you specify, see, in the as whom clause of this user spec, you can specify you can't run stuff as root, for instance, right? And so this particular one, I actually do need to copy and paste my username, because the it's not as intuitive. Okay, sudo L, right. So generally speaking, if I try to do anything, either not as this particular application, or if I try to do that but as root, it's obviously not going to work because it is explicitly stated in the user spec. However, given this particular type of sudo, you don't have to worry about that, right? And so let me get, excuse me while I whip that out. Okay. Hold on, where's my? So yeah, you simply just do sudo u, and there's tons of scripts too where you basically scrape the internet looking for this. They're pretty nifty. So if I try to run anything other than those two, you'll get prompted by password, which means given that there's no password, if you see it asking for password, you're wrong. So we'll just do ID, and we're root. We at least have the root's UID, and if we do bash, we are now root. Okay, that is good. So a recap: we covered sudo, sudoers. We went through open, sudo. We covered a bunch of easier application stuff. This is out of order a little bit. Disregard it. No, and so yeah, we covered a variety of things from different angles, from GTFO bins to some CVEs, from stuff from exploit-DB, and just try to develop the whole mindset, right? That you can really dig into sudo and get creative and really have fun, with it. And so I tried to cite I tried to cite everything that I could that I pull from, and I included that at the very end. If you happen to see your material featured in here and I did not give you proper citation, just let me know and I'll add it. I'm not trying to plagiarize your stuff. I try to give all the citation and credit where it is due. And that is my talk. Okay, do we have any questions?
I was trying to get the mute button working, but yeah, basically, first of all, thank you so much for supporting us and for the great presentation here. We're accepting questions through Discord, and if you just join us in the bottom of the screen, there should be, whether you're on Twitch or YouTube, there should be a link to our website, and of course from there you can actually get to our Discord channel. So if you have any questions for Tyler, please do so there. We're going to go in a brief break, and then the next presenter will start in about 15 minutes. Thank you again.